Well, here we are, folks. Another Tuesday evening. Great to have you on. Put on the pre-show just for a second. Nice to see so many people in the chat already, and a few new names as well as some of the old faithfuls. So welcome or welcome back. Happy New Year for those who haven't been on the show so far this year. And Very important conversation tonight, of course, with the latest stress data. Just before I get into that, of course, the dogs are here. They've been making a bit of noise, so if it gets too bad, I might have to take them out and lock them elsewhere in the house. But at the moment, they seem to be more relaxed. So the squirrels were making noise this morning, the owls as well. So we had a few early morning eruptions. And just for those who might be interested in the setup, this is the studio here. Obviously, I've got no guest tonight. It's just myself. So that screen is blank, but I've got all of the content here and here. And I've got the chat up the top there and the control screen over there too. So that's the way the system works. Still got a few tweaks to do, but it's, coming along. And it's pretty stable now. Obviously, I had to relocate and get everything sorted out over the last few months. And pleased to say that the studio is functioning pretty well now. So tonight we're going to look at some very important information and also take some questions, of course, in the normal sense. So let's take the pre-show off. And I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 9th of January 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on tonight. And it's just me and no guests because once a month I go through the detailed information relating to my modeling and specifically look at the financial stress and household stress issues. Now, in tonight's show, what I want to do is to break into 3 sections. I just want to give you some updates with some of the latest financial information that's just come out. Then we'll look at some of the modeling at a high level. And then the third section will be down at the postcode level. And I want to try and devote as much as I can to that third level because a lot of the issues that I'm seeing are very much there when you get into the granularity. And as I often say, you need to get granular if you want to understand what's going on. Before I do that, let me just remind you that I always do that we have some house rules. The first is, of course, that we do not provide financial advice or legal advice or anything such as that. This is a general conversation only. If you need financial advice, go speak to a financial advisor or a financial counselor. It's also worth saying, I think, that as always, please play nice in the chat room, but feel free to use the chat. It's a great way to share your thoughts and opinions and ask questions if you like, because this is all about interaction with the audience. And one of the reasons why I do the live streams is because I really enjoy those interactions. This is as at the 9th of January 24, if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a question and make sure I see it, use @WalkTheWorld. That'll get it in my question queue, and that's going to be much more likely that I'll be able to see it. I do, unfortunately, sometimes miss questions because there's so much going on in the chat, and of course, I've got a few other things going on here as well. But use @WalkTheWorld, that certainly helps. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question to the top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do here. And as I've said a few times, we don't do this for profit. We do this because we think this is a really important conversation to have. And knowing what we know about what's going on at the moment, I think this is a really important time to be thinking about how households are bearing up under the significant strains that many households are under. And I will, of course, say that not all households are experiencing the same issues, as we'll see later. There are some that are doing very well, but there are others that are doing less well. And unfortunately, I think the politicians are tending to focus more on the Alice in Wonderland story rather than reality. So what I try to do here is to really get real with regard to what's going on the ground. And people ask me, why do I do this? Well, I do it because I don't feel that the information that's currently available from many other sources is really appropriate to get a balance as to what's going on. So what I try to do is to paint a bit of a picture as to what I'm seeing from my surveys, which of course are running all the time. And on that vogue, let me just start with a few high-level observations. Of course, one of the things that came out today was retail sales. This is from AMP, who was kind enough to put some of the charts together in a rather nice way, and they basically made the point that whilst retail sales were up year on year 2.2%, that was helped by the Black Friday promotions and consumers seeking discounts. But this is a really important point, they're still in negative real terms, and they're down sharply on a per capita basis if you adjust it for surging in population. So essentially, this is not necessarily the good news story that, of course, some of those in the mainstream were reporting. Also, consumer confidence was reported as higher. This is, again, data today from ANZ Roy Morgan. It's the highest level since late January 2023, but if you look at it, it's still languishing. And they make the point that whilst confidence typically lifts a little in January, this is the third largest jump. But of course, it was way down before, and it's still in negative, strongly negative territory. Now, some other interesting articles. Cookie Boy sent me this one on the High Cookie. I see you've come in the chat there. Borrowers hopes for rate relief as markets push out RBA cut timing to September. So the fade now is in. In other words, it's going to be longer before we see much in the way of rate relief. And I still think it'll be late this year or maybe even later. And one of the interesting observations about this was that, everyone is sort of hoping that there will be a rate cut, but it may not come. And it's interesting that Chalmers said that wages growth is absolutely central to the cost of living plan. They got a plan, have they? But of course, the truth is that in real terms, people are still going backwards. Another way of looking at it is, and this is from the Financial Review, there's a bit of a hangover, and ANZ senior economist expects it to last for at least the next 6 months. The first half of the year will continue to see the impact of high rates, inflation, and bracket creep, she says, and that's what I'm seeing in my surveys. There's also a chance, at least according to the central bank, that interest rates could rise in the new year if inflation remains stubbornly high. So it's not necessarily, absolutely baked in that rates will drop. Maybe they'll go up first. Now, it's interesting, of course, that there are some other political battles going on. The Greens are threatening to sink the federal government's scheme designed to help some Australians become homeowners. Of course, it's a bit of a bribe trying to get more people to come into the market. They're linking it back to the rents freeze. So there's a political fight going on. I think we'll see more of that. And I quite like this little chart, which I saw, which really encapsulate it. I just need to subsidize demand. I know. Home prices go up. People get angry. I subsidize demand. I just need to subsidize demand. And that really sums up the political landscape. But of course, it doesn't help. It doesn't solve the fundamental issues with housing. So I think that's worth just thinking about. Now, under interesting conversations, the case for the stage 3 tax cuts is fading according to the Financial Review. The good times are unlikely to last. Much of the windfall that pushed the budget into surplus from our fossil fuel exports is fading. So, if you had your time over again, then the stage 3 tax cuts would not be a fiscal intervention you'd be planning now. And I think that's exactly right. I think it's a false dawn. And frankly, given everything we know, I think there's some big questions around it. It was a political stunt, of course, more than anything else. Also, just worth highlighting that the container rates are spiking. So this is now an inflationary pressure that we perhaps weren't expecting thanks to the conflict in the Middle East. And that means that ships are going round rather than through the Suez Canal. And that's just putting costs up. So think about whether that will flow back into higher inflation. Quite possibly. Remember that goods inflation is where inflation started. Well, apart from the central bank interventions, of course, with quantitative easing. And just on average capital city home prices, again, this is from AMP, sliding back down again in terms of relative growth. So the growth is slowing. And the interesting question now is where to from here. And I'll show you some scenarios a bit later. But it is definitely up and down at the moment. And I will remind you that the household debt to income ratio in Australia is massively high. We're right at the top of the chart, as you can see here again from AMP. And that's a real concern, of course, because the debt burden on many households is really, really severe. And more people are still switching from fixed to variable rates, which is making it very uncomfortable for many. And just in that, in terms of the income measures, real household disposable income is the lowest in history. It's down minus 5.6%, according to some recently released research. So we know that in real terms, households are going backwards. And of course, that's why this is a very important conversation when it comes to what's happening to real households on the ground, which is what my surveys are getting at. And just to finish that little story, it is worth highlighting that, of course, it's the income tax payments as well as the interest payments which are actually hurting. Income tax is higher than it's been for a long, long time, partly because of the freeze in the brackets and partly because of course, that corporate taxation is dropping, but household taxation isn't. I come right back to whether stage 3 tax cuts therefore is relevant. Probably not. And there's a little bit of interesting stuff coming on at the moment. This couple couldn't afford a home, so they invested in a rental instead. But this was a little quote from Tim Lawless. CoreLogic Research Director says affordability was unlikely to improve either until interest rates or home values dropped significantly, which is probably right. And, as I said, interest rates are unlikely to drop anytime soon. And, home values, maybe they'll begin to slide. We'll see. Now, I made a show earlier on called Household Financial Distress Spreads Further. And this show I put out a couple of days ago because what I realized that when I was making these shows previously, I'd spend a lot of time on the detailed research that we did in the models, and therefore I didn't have a lot of time to answer questions. So what I've done is to give you the detailed story with regards to our financial modeling and stress in that particular show that was up a couple of days ago. Wonder whether you like the AI generated image there. I experimented with that for the first time. But nevertheless, if you want the detailed story with regards to how we do our financial stress modeling, etc., go look at that afterwards. Not now, afterwards. But nevertheless, I will just quickly say that we do use our core market model with the surveys feeding our research, that we slice and dice the data, that we can look at the scenarios as well. And that means we can put all the elements together to be able to actually put some thoughts on the table as to where prices may go. Now, that's not necessarily a forecast, but it's showing what the sensitivities are and what might be driving it. And by the way, we do still provide a one-to-one service. If you want a conversation with me about a particular suburb, we can do that. I do have a lot of data, but of course, it's not financial advice. I can look at the stress data, the home price trend data, etc., based on the modeling. There's a conversation about an hour via Zoom or phone, and there is a cost involved simply because it's expensive to do and takes a lot of research time. But we are booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead. If you'd like to make an appointment to do that, you can go via the DFA blog. And now quickly on stress, of course, I look at it on a cash flow basis. And that means that if you've got cash flow problems, excluding one-off discretionary, then you are stressed, either mortgage stress or rental stress. I also look at overall financial stress with stressed investors in the category 2, and that gives us a view. And I do look at it both from a household count and percentage perspective. I've said before, the count's probably a better way of looking at what's really going on because it's where the big numbers are that's the real question. Now, the RBA put this chart into one of the recent presentations. I think it's a really good chart because it shows you the funnel. You start with budget pressures. Over time, if things don't improve, then you might start missing payments and ultimately you might go insolvent or be foreclosed. I'm measuring stress very much at the start of it, at the input to the hopper. And so my definition of stress, being broad, is looking at the very early stages. But there is a sort of a 2 to 3 year journey between those initial pressures and other things happening later. So this is quite an important chart just to show you that this is in evolution. Now, this December data, as I quickly showed the other day, is not looking good. So 73% of those in rental stress have difficulties on cash flow, and 50.2% of those with mortgages have mortgage stress. pretty much as high as it's been, unfortunately. And the latest from the RBA showed that the household debt to income ratios are still very high. Remember, of course, that this is misrepresenting because it's 1/3 of people have a mortgage, whereas they divide it by all households. So it's understating the truth. Here is the information for December. I'm not going to go through in detail. If you want the detail, go and look at the other show. But just to say that you can see there that the yellow areas show improvement. So an increase from last month. The blue shows an improvement from last month. So you can see that South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, Western Australia, and the total is up for mortgage stress. It's a bit more mixed for rental stress, but Queensland is definitely seeing a rise. One of the reasons why we're seeing rental stress just easing back slightly is we had a little bit of income improvement with low income improvements coming in over the last 2 or 3 months. That's helping a few people, but only slightly. Stressed investors are still struggling in some areas, and overall financial stress is highest in Queensland. And also, of course, the ACT. Interestingly, I think the ACT is often misunderstood. There are a lot of people with good contracts with government there, but also a lot of people who don't have that. So there's a bit of a diversity of outcome there. But you can see there that the overall stress levels are pretty high, and pretty much across the country, nearly half of all households now have cash flow issues, which is tremendously high and concerning. Now, I can slice and dice it by different segments, of course, too, but I'll just make a quick comment on young growing families, first-time buyers, and those on the urban fringe are definitely under stress, as well as those in the rental sector, the first-generation Australians, and pretty much all types of households are being impacted more or less. Interestingly, from an investment perspective, quite a few of those more affluent households, whether they're exclusive professionals or young affluents, have the highest degree of investor stress because some of their investment properties aren't performing very well. One of the reasons why we're seeing more investment properties being listed. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to highlight the top 2 or 3, Campbelltown and Wanneroo in Western Australia and Roxburgh Park in Victoria, the top 3. You can see the numbers are quite big and rising. Quite a few of these are high growth corridors, as we often see. In the rental stress area, you can see that the centre of Melbourne and Toowoomba and Liverpool are at the top of the list, then up in Queensland around Southport. In the investor land, centre of Melbourne and Wentworthville and Cranbourne and Ryde is where a lot of the issues are in terms of the counts. And in terms of the financial stress, overall aggregated, it's Toowoomba at the top of the list, then Liverpool, then Campbelltown, and then those high growth corridors in Victoria, and then, of course, a few over in WA and Queensland as well. So it's quite widespread. I will highlight the fact that some of the regional areas like Ipswich and Ballarat are also impacted. So it isn't just the central areas of our major cities or the urban fringe, it's out in the regions too. I also model defaults, and this is the prospect of defaults over the next year based on my modelling. It's an estimate, it's not a forecast, but it's interesting that some of these high growth corridors like Cranbourne and Hobbs Crossing Tunny are right up there. Mandurah is still there. That's because we had a bounce in house prices 2014-15. Then there was a significant fall, and they're rising a little now, but still struggling. So they're there in the list. And then more of those high growth corridors. Also, it's worth highlighting that some of those regional areas are also experiencing issues too. Bundaberg is on the list. Now, from a scenario perspective, just to remind you that we don't forecast, we look at scenarios, what may happen. They're running forward from today, and we have 3 scenarios. The Goldilocks zone, which is basically if everything goes really well and rates don't go any higher and then fall. We have the soft landing scenario where rates go a little higher, which means that rates go higher, but then inflation stays above target until 25, which is what the RBA, of course, is saying, but no recession. Migration maybe eases a bit. And then the worst case is nightmare scenario where rates go even higher. Things go significantly worse. We get a recession, they cut rates, migration drops, but it's all a bit too late. So those are the 3 scenarios we use. And just to give you a bit of a flavour, these have a significant and profound impact on where prices may go from both units and houses, with, of course, the best case, a potential rise, but the worst case, a potential fall. The base case, which is what I think is most likely to happen, is showing on aggregate a little easing over the next 2 or 3 years based on what I'm seeing at the moment. So there you go. That's a little bit of an introduction. I've run through it much more quickly than normal. As I say, if you want the more detailed story about the analysis, then go look at that earlier show that I mentioned, because I wanted to get on to the next part of the conversation. And it's worth, I think, highlighting that the modeling changes each month. One of the things I will say is that because we've got large accounts in the mapping, which I also showed in that earlier show, what I've found quite often is that some of those that were read earlier on are now not necessarily read. In other words, the most significantly high counts, simply because we've got other postcodes with more people coming in. And the message at the moment is that stress is spreading more broadly than it was. And what that means is, of course, that households essentially are getting more caught up in this. So whilst it was more concentrated, if you go back a year or 2 years, to a relatively smaller number of postcodes, in fact, there's a greater count of households now across more postcodes. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about the modeling that we do at a granular level. And I'm going to use this as the example just because it's one that I happen to always load. I always look at Wollongong. So just to explain how this template works, because I'm going to use this for the next part of the show and explore some of the differences. And there are some dimensions to this data which is quite important. Obviously, we can see the issue here with households, how many are borrowing, how many are renting. We've also got the stress data. We've also got the price scenario data. We've got some information about the geographic location, and we've also got information relating to the property profiles as well, including the gross investment yield and the taxable income, and that allows us then to look at the disposable monthly income. So that's the way that the model actually works. And the thing about this modeling is that it is quite dynamic, updated every month as new information comes in. So if I go back now to the core model, so this is now the live model. And let me just put this up here so I can get to it. Yeah. Now, hopefully, we can see that. Yeah. Okay. So this has happened to be one that I did the other day. Now, I did have one request pre-show, which I'm just going to put this one up at the moment. So we were asked for postcode 2257. So I'm going to put 2257 now into the show. And we can look at a real example. So this is Edlong Beach on the Central Coast. And you can see immediately that we've got 13,000 households there. It's roughly a third, 31% of borrowing, 31% of renting. Mortgage stress is at 31%, and rental stress is much higher at 88%. Overall financial stress is around the 43.5% level, which is quite high. From a mix of properties, a lot of it's houses, 73%. We've got some units and other types of property, including other retail and other types of property. The people ratio is quite interesting. So that's at 2. Now, the people ratio is about, mix of households. Is it a household with kids, or is it a single person? So a lower count suggests it's more likely to be individuals. A higher count is more likely to be a household with maybe kids. The vacancy rate's quite high now. Of course, vacancy rates can be things like Airbnb, second homes, holiday lets, those sorts of things. So this is based on the last census. Gross investment yield is important. The gross investment yield, of course, is the yield comparing the theoretical rent that you can generate versus the current price of the property. Doesn't tell you much really, but it's the one that's always quoted. The net investment yield is the really important one. That's the cash flow. So money in, money out. What am I paying on the mortgage? What am I paying on maintenance, et cetera, et cetera? What am I paying on management fees, as well as what am I actually generating in terms of rental income? And of course, sometimes the rental income is lower because people aren't necessarily occupying 100% of the time. There might be vacancies, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, it's worth noting that the banks, of course, assume a level of vacancy when they actually make some assessments. We've also got taxable income, so 77 versus 72. If you see I'm just going to take a drink, excuse me. if you see the household census, that's actually household level. Sometimes you'll see this a lot higher. When it's a lot higher, that's suggesting that multiple incomes are going in to pay the mortgage. And so we can now look at the disposable income for 4531 is the average. That's after tax. It's available money to spend. We then say how much of it is going on mortgage, 56% here, and 44% is going on the average rent, which is 1993. And just in terms of the scenarios, well, there is a scenario here that could suggest a rise of about 3 to 4% over the next 12 months for houses and about 11% over the next 3 years. But the base case is a small fall. And of course, the worst case, if things go really pear-shaped, is a more significant fall. So that gives you a bit of a flavor of the sensitivity. And so we are somewhere between a small rise and a small fall. Okay, now I've got another one here, again, before the show. Bud asked me for postcode 6056. So let's go there. And so this is Midland in Western Australia. And here we've got 17,000 households with 45% borrowing. So this is a newish suburb, I would suggest, with lots of new development. 29% are renting, only 25% own outright. 27% are in mortgage stress, 86% of renters are in rental stress. Overall financial stress is just below 50%. A lot of it's houses, so 79%, small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is higher, so it's going to be households rather than most individuals. Vacancy rate's 9.1%, so that could be because there's a lot of property yet to be occupied. Gross investment yield's 4.1, net investment yield is absolutely flat, so people are not actually making a return from a cash flow perspective on the net investment property. And looking at the taxable income, 77 versus 76. And that's 1,000. And looking at the disposable monthly income, 4,726, with 43% going on the typical mortgage and 31% going on the typical rent. And that then takes us to the scenario. So the scenario still is in the West because prices are quite buoyant. The best case rise of about 7% over the next 12 months. The base case a rise of 1% and a fall of 4% if things go really pear-shaped. And you can see how that extrapolates out. This is a cumulative view over 36 months. So that's that one. And then I also got from Sean 6210, which you may well recognize because, of course, it's Mandurah. And there we have, this is another WA postcode, 31,000 households with 32% owning outright, 39% borrowing, ooch, and 28% renting. We have 28% of borrowers in mortgage stress. We have 60% of people in rental stress. We have some investment stress, and overall financial stress is 34%. Mostly houses, 81%, but some units and other types of property. We had a lower people ratio, 1.87, and high vacancy rates, 17.1%. Now, that could be second homes, Airbnb, etc., but I also think that some of the properties there are not necessarily occupied at the moment. Gross investment yield is 4.1. Net investment yield is 0.2 positive. The ATO says the taxable income is about 87,000. The household census said 63,000. And that gives us a disposable monthly of just over 4,000 with 50% which going on the average mortgage and 37% going on the average rent, which is 1,495. And you can see here that, again, because of the Western Australian momentum on prices, the best case scenario is a rise over the next 12 months and beyond. The base case, a small rise, and a worst case scenario would be a fall if, in fact, the economy goes into recession. Okay, now I'm going to look at the chat tonight. I'm just going to roll back up to near the top and see where the postcode questions start. Okay, let's put that up there. So this is postcode 4127. Love your work. Always look forward to the monthly love streams. Okay. Well, I'll take it. 4127. Okay, 4127. I'm just going to take you off this chat there so you can see so this is Daisy Hill in Queensland. Just over 10,000 households in the particular postcode with 43.6% borrowing. That's a high number, isn't it? 33% renting. A lot of mortgage stress. It says 100%. It's plus or minus 2%, so it might not be everybody, but a lot of people are in difficulty. 73% are in rental stress. Overall financial stress is also quite high. And look at even the investment stress is 27%. So from a mix of properties, it's 78% houses, a small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is high, so there's a lot of families. Vacancy rate's about 5%. And the gross investment yield is 4.6. Net investment yield is 0.7. The average taxable is about 70,000. The household census is 83. That would suggest that it's more than a single income going to support the properties there. And also worth noting that the disposable monthly income just over 5,000, with 39% going on the average mortgage payment of just over $2,000 and 32% going on the average rent at 1,704. And from a scenario perspective, well, in the best case scenario, prices in Queensland could continue to rise over the next 12 months, about 3% higher for houses, and cumulatively maybe 8% over the next 3 years. But the base case is a bit of a fall, and that fall extending. And of course, the worst case would be a considerable drop. So that's the story there. Let's see what else we can find. Okay, BT says, can you check 4879? Sure I can. .4879 is Palm Cove in the far north. Maybe impacted by the recent floods as well. So I haven't necessarily taken account of the flood impact on what's going on because it's too soon. It will come out in the next surveys. Okay, households 8,800 with 27% owning outright, 42% are borrowing, 30% are renting. You can see there that the borrowers in mortgage stress are at 37%, 58% in rental stress, and overall financial stress at 36%. On the best case scenario, we see small price rises, 6.9% over the next 12 months and maybe 90% over 3 months, but the base case, a very small rise, and worst case, a bit of a fall. Looking at the mix of properties, a lot of them are houses. There are some other units and other types of properties as well, and the people ratio is above 2, so that's indicating households rather than individuals. And the vacancy rate is 13.2%. Again, it could be holiday homes, Airbnb, etc., etc. Gross investment yield is 4.3, net investment yield is positive 0.4. The individual taxable from the ATO was 76,000 and 88,000 from the census, and that gives us a disposable monthly of 5,500, with 37.8% going on the mortgage and 36% going on the average rent. Okay, here's the next one, 5014. So this is Royal Park in the Adelaide City. Recent sales are observed over the median. Your videos have been insightful. Thank you for your constant hard work. Glad to help, and thank you very much for your acknowledgement. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that some of this work that I do really helps people. That's why I'm doing it. Okay, so this is the information there in 5014. 5,600 households with 26% owning outright, 42% are borrowing, 30% are renting, 42% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress. The house mix is 73% versus a small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is 2.1. Vacancy rate 6%. Gross investment yield 4.2 versus net investment at 0.4. The average taxable is 66,000 versus 71,000 from the census. Disposal monthly is about 4,798, just over around 5,000, with 39.6% going on the average mortgage payment, 1,900, and 31.2% for 1,495 going on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, the best case scenario are continued rises over the next 2 or 3 years if things go really well. But the base case is a little bit of a fall, not dramatic, but a little bit of a fall. And the worst case, a more significant fall. Okay, let's go to another one. Okay, so this is postcode 2850. And would ask you, if you've put your request in, please don't keep putting it in, because it confuses me and makes it quite difficult to see what's going on. I will try and get to as many as I can. This is for 2850. And this is, of course, Budgie in New South Wales, up in the northwest, Upper Hunter. 7,455 households, 34% own outright, 38% are borrowing, and 27% are renting. About half are in mortgage stress, 87% are in rental stress. There is some investor stress, but it's not that high, and overall financial stress is at 45%. 89% are houses, small number of units and other types. People ratios at 2.1, so a little higher. So that would indicate more mature households possibly. Vacancy rate's very high at 16, so that could also suggest some second homes, Airbnb, and those sorts of things. Gross investment yield, 3.1. Net investment yield, minus 0.3, so not flash. Average taxable, 82,000. Household census says 86,000, so we're in the 80s. Gives a disposable monthly of 5,597 on average, with 37% going on the average mortgage of just over $2,000 and the average rent at just over $1,794. And looking at the cumulative price scenarios, the best case is small rise, 3% or so over the next 3 months. 3 years, 3 months. Base case, a bit of a fall. Worst case, a significant fall. And if you look at the base case, minus 2% over the next 12 months and minus 7.6% in the worst case scenario. Units, a little bit less. I don't necessarily cover the units in the conversation here because most of the properties are houses. Okay. So Lily White said 5540. 5540. Okay, so that's Port Pirie South, obviously in the Murraylands. And excellent info. Thank you very much. I appreciate the comment. And yeah, well, we try to help people make better decisions by understanding what's going on, which is what I'm trying to do here. So 6,700 households, 31% owning outright, 36% borrowing, 32% renting. And around 12% in mortgage stress, so not too bad. Rental stress, 80%. As always, rental stress tends to be quite a lot higher because a lot of people who rent are actually less able to afford to do anything else other than rent. And there was some data out today, which I didn't have time to include, which showed that rents have gone up dramatically again over the last 12 months. So it's a continued problem, of course. And overall financial stress at 37%. 84% of houses, small number of units. People ratio is a bit low, 1.96. And the vacancy rate's 11.6. So possibly some second homes and things there too. Gross investment yield, 4.3%. Net investment yield, positive 0.4%. Average taxable, 66,000 from the ATO and 55,000 from the census. And I would make the point that where you've got a lot of Airbnb and other vacant property, often the household census number comes in lower than the taxable income. So that's another indicator of possible Airbnb and holiday homes and things. Disposable monthly income, 3,569, with 32% going on the average mortgage and 25% going on the average rent. From a scenario perspective, best case scenario would be a further rise in prices. The base case, a very small rise, 0.4% over 3 years. The worst case, a fall of up to 20% over 3 years. So you can see it does depend on what happens in the broader economy. Right, just working down my list. BT came in again with 4879. So where's this Palm Cove in the far north? I think I've done that one. So I think you may have put it in twice. So I'm not going to continue with that. I would ask you please not to put them in multiple times. It just confuses the issue. Okay. Bossman says 4510. This is Caboolture up in Brisbane. Just get rid of the chat so you can see it. This is 20,000 households with 23% earning outright, 38% borrowing and 38% renting. And you can see here that mortgage stress is at 15%, not too bad, but rental stress is very high, 81%. Overall financial stress is at 45.7%. 83% of houses, small number of units. The people ratio is quite high, 2.43, so that's going to be households with kids as well. Vacancy rate 6.9%. Again, that's quite high, so maybe you've got some Airbnb and what have you going on there. 4.5% gross investment yield, 0.6% net investment yield. 62,000 from the taxable the ATO, that's on an individual basis, and 68,000 from the census. Gives a disposal monthly of 4,400, with 43% going on the average borrowing and 36% going on the average rent. And you can see here that the best case scenario is a rise of 6% over the next 12 months. Base case, almost nothing at all, and a small fall over 3 years. Actually, the worst case, a more considerable fall. Okay, let's continue down my list. A lot of people saying hi. I'm not going to put all of the highs up on the screen, but welcome to you all, and great to see you coming on. And Cookie Boy said, 7,000. Did you and the doggies survive the freeze? We had the first level. We actually had the first level of snow, but not a lot, but a little layer of snow for about an hour last night when I was out with the dogs. That's quite funny. I'm not sure whether they've ever seen snow because they actually grew up on a farm near Canberra, so you could have snow in Canberra, of course. But it was the first time they saw UK snow, so it'll be interesting to see. It's gone now. It's still quite cold, but not as cold as Norway. All right, let's go back to the slides. 7,000 centre of Hobart. It's a good call, actually, because Hobart's quite an interesting story. Take you off the chat. Okay. 6,400 in the centre of Hobart. 28% own outright, 28% borrowing, but a lot are renting, 42% are renting. 45% in mortgage stress, 78% in rental stress, overall financial stress above 50% at 52%. There's a mixture of houses, 61%, and units and other types of property. People ratio is just 2, so that would suggest some sole families as well as families with kids. High vacancy rates, 10.6%. Now, of course, that could well be Airbnb and short-term lets and things. You'd expect that, I guess, in the centre of the city. 5.4% gross investment yield, 1.7% net investment yield, so better than some we've seen. Average taxable 82,000 compared with 96,000 from the census. Gives a disposal monthly of about $6,200 with 35.3% going on the average mortgage and 31% going on the average rent. Looking at the scenario as well, frankly, even in the best case scenario, it's very hard to see much price growth over the next year or 3 years, maybe 1.1% over 3 years in the best case scenario. Of course, prices in Hobart have been sliding recently. The base case is a more significant fall, and the worst case is a significant fall, and the same with units too. So that gives you a bit of a flavour there. Okay, what else have we got? Adam's asked for, missed. Try that again. Postcode 3810. Okay, so this is Pakenham in Melbourne. Now, Pakenham, of course, has been on my list for some time as a high-stressed area, and you can really see this coming through. 20,000 households, 15%, just 15% and outright. Look at this, 53% are borrowing. 53%, that's more than half the population. It's very high, and 31% are renting. Mortgage stress is at 90%. That's more than 9,600 households. 65% of those in rental stress, more than 4,000. And you can see there that the overall financial stress metric is very, very high as a result of that, 74%. Looking at the mix, a lot of them are houses, 86%, small number of units and other types of property. People ratio is quite high, so you're going to see quite large households there, I think. And the vacancy rate's quite low at 4.9%. Gross investment yield is 3.3. Net investment yield is negative, so minus 0.3%. So a lot of investors are out of pocket from a cash flow perspective. One of the reasons why in Melbourne people are selling up big time at the moment from investment properties. Gross investment is still positive, but net investment yield negative. Looking at the taxable income from the ATO at 67,000. Household census says 87,000. You can see here that it's 1+ incomes to go to pay the mortgage. That gives a monthly disposable of 5,360, with 38% going on the average mortgage, more than $2,000, and 32.6% going on the average rent. And I will just make a point. These average are actually based on not just new mortgages, but all mortgages. So if there are a lot of people who are actually well down on their mortgage repayments, so their actually mortgages a lot smaller, then the disposable monthly actually does drop. Whereas if you have a lot of new people with high mortgages and big mortgages, then of course the disposable monthly is quite a lot higher. Oh, and the other thing I'll just say, one of the reasons why I actually call out the numbers rather than just show the slide is because I do have quite a few people who are visually impaired who watch the show or listen to the show. And so I want to make sure that those who can't see the slides can still get a good take on the information that we're putting up there. So that's why I do this the way I do it, which is why I wanted to make more time for the conversations around postcodes today and rush through some of the other material a bit quickly than sometimes. Okay, let's find another one to look at. Adam C says, I think Martin didn't catch the order correct from live to love. Very good. No, I did see that, and I love that comment too. So thank you. Okay, more postcodes. Jan said 7250. So this could be quite interesting. So this is up in Riverside, which includes, of course, Launceston. And unfortunately, this is another rather sad story. Take you off so you can see. 21,000 households in this area, 33% are outright, 36% are borrowing, 29% are renting. And that gives you, let's take a drink, excuse me a second. Because I'm doing all the talking tonight, so I can't sup my water when the other person's talking. 100% in mortgage stress, 100% in rental stress. Now, as I said before, 100% is plus or minus 2%. So it might be a little up, little down, but a lot of people have difficulty. And that's pretty sad, unfortunately. So the overall financial stress is very high at 69.4%. 81% are houses, 10% are units, and other types of property, 8.2%. People ratios above 2, and the vacancy rate's at 7.2%. So that may possibly be some Airbnb and holiday lets and things and second homes as well. Gross investment yield's 4.8, net investment yield 1.7. Average taxable is 74,000. The census says 72,000. And the disposable monthly, 5,500, suggests that 28% are going on the average mortgage and 25% are going on the average rent. And so that's the story there. So it's a bit of a hotspot, one of my hotspots in and around Tasmania that I've seen. One, two, three Logic said 3030. Which Dermont. That's another of those stressed areas, of course, that pops up quite often, including Point Cook. A lot of first-generation Australians living in the area, and a lot of newly purchased property. You can see here that 16%, just 16% own outright, 50% are borrowing, and 33% are renting. 34% are in mortgage stress, 75% are in rental stress. Overall financial stress is 46%. The story is that 86% of houses are, or 8% of properties houses, I should say, a small number of units and other types too. 2.71, so quite a high count there, so quite a lot of households with kids. Vacancy rates 7.4%. That could be accounted for by some new properties being built still in the area. And gross investment yield is 3.2. Net investment yield is minus 0.4%. This, of course, is one of those high growth corridors. And looking at the taxable income, 77,000. The household census is 106. Now, this is very important to understand. This is another great example of where multiple incomes are going to get that mortgage. And of course, the banks have been much more willing to lend big. It's to the point where, in fact, when CBA recently published some analysis, they assumed two full incomes as an average household situation, which I thought was ridiculous. Disposable monthly income 6,706 with 35.8% on the borrowing. That's the mortgage, of course, and 27.6% or 1,849 going on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, there is a scenario where in the best case you might see a small rise, maybe 5% over 3 years, but the base case is a fall, 3.8% this year and 4.3% over 3 years. And the worst case is a more significant fall. Okay, as Drew says, fondle that like button. Sorry for the caps. No, absolutely. Please like and share. It really is important. Let me just make the point here that by liking and sharing, it helps to lift the ranking on YouTube, which means that more people can see the shows, and that means that more people can get hold of the information. So it is really, really important. And I do encourage you, please, to like and share this information. And of course, do subscribe as well if you haven't subscribed, because that means that you can then get you can get alerts. And of course, if you ring the bell as well, you can get alerts when I go live every Tuesday, of course, as well as the other shows that I do. So I really appreciate those who do like the posts, and please like. It really is appreciated. Okay, let's do. Junta says 5162. We'll try that one. So that's in Morford Vale. One thing I love doing about doing this is I hear about places I've never been to, but I can imagine a little bit. So it's rather good. 15,000 households here with 25% owning outright. 49% are borrowing. Could be a high growth corridor. 25% are renting. The 42% are in mortgage stress, 45% in rental stress, overall financial stress at 36%. 86% of houses, some units, other types of property too. People ratio is quite high, so you're going to see households with kids as well. Vacancy rates pretty low at 4.7%. Gross investment yield is 4.3. Net investment yield is positive 0.5. The taxable income from the ATO is 61,000 compared with the census at 68,000. And that gives a disposable monthly income around 4,300 with 35% going on the typical mortgage, 1,560, and 34% going on the typical rent, 1,495. From a scenario perspective, the best case scenario would be a rise over the next 12 months of about 6%. The base case, a small rise, in fact, over 3 years, just 1.9%. And the worst case would be a more significant fall. Okay, 2250 said Pete. This is West Gosford and Gosford. I should explain the short locations here are the ones that the ATO uses. So it's worth looking into the suburbs because it includes more than just the West Gosford one. And this is 28,000 households with 27% owning outright, 40% are borrowing, 31% are renting, 27% in mortgage stress, 92% in rentals, 27% in mortgage stress, 92% in rental stress, overall financial stress at 48%. And you can see here that those 69% are houses, quite a few units and other types of property as well. People ratio is quite high. So that's more mature households, possibly 6.6% vacancy rates, maybe some Airbnb and second homes there as well. Gross investment yield 3.5, net investment yield minus 0.1%. Average taxable 77,000 versus 84,000 from the census. Gives a disposal monthly around 5,100 with 46.5% ooch going on the average mortgage at $2,400 and 38.6% going on the average rent. And given that significantly high number they're borrowing, I suspect there's probably some new developments going on there. Looking at the scenarios, well, there is a best case scenario of a small rise, 3.7% over the next 12 months, and maybe 12% over 3 years, but the base case will be a small fall, 2% over 12 months and 7.4% over 3 years, and the worst case, of course, more significant falls. Right, what else have we got here? Cookie Boy says 2077, which is Hornsby, for the one I love. Okay, Hornsby 17,000, 21% owning outright, 39% borrowing, 39% renting. Mortgage stress at 23%, rental stress at 69%. Stressed investors are there too at 44%, and overall financial stress is above 50 at 56%. That's interesting here. The mix is quite different from some of the others we've seen. 39% are houses, 55% are units. So a lot of new development, of course, and high rise, etc. in that area, particularly around the train line. And the people ratio is 2.41. So quite high. 6.6% vacant with 3.5% on gross investment and minus 0.2% in net investment yield. One of the things I quite often see in these high-rise areas is a lot of investors losing money on a cash flow basis. Looking at the taxable income, 85,000 compared with 109. So a lot of people are putting more than one income into paying the mortgage. Gives a monthly disposal around 6,343 with 44% going on the average mortgage, 2,820, and 36% going on the average rent at 2,292. Now looking at the scenarios, we can see there that the best case scenario is a small rise, 3% this year and 12% over 3 years, but the base case is a bit of a fall, not majorly so, 1.9% over the next 12 months and 7.4% over the next 3 years, but the worst case, more significant falls. And because there's more units than houses, I will just highlight the fact that units are moving in a somewhat similar direction, but not quite so much potentially, with small falls there in the base case scenario and more significant falls in the worst case scenario. It's interesting that Infinity said, include a scenario where there is a renters, middle class, civil unrest, and the other scenario is just unreal, doubling every year or two. Well, yeah, I mean, the thing about scenarios is I could make lots and lots of different scenarios, and I do actually create different scenarios for different household, different conversations that I have, including some of the people who work with me commercially. So what I try to do in my models here is to try and put 3 that I think are roughly, indicative of the sort of the range and direction, but there are many others too. And we will, of course, see we will see some, movements that may be different from that. But scenarios are that. These are not predictions, and I get cross when people say, "Oh, you're predicting X, Y." No, these are scenarios. This is what the model says based on the inputs that I put in. And if you wanted another set of inputs, I'm happy to run a scenario looking at those inputs. But these are the ones that I do on a regular basis. Now, I don't understand this one, 1042.3. So you'll have to explain that. That's beyond my wit to understand. Cameron asks for 2234. Which I can do. So let's go back to the slides. This is Alfred's Point in the Sutherland area. And we can see here we've got 10,300 households, 39% owning outright, 50% are borrowing, and only 9.9% are renting. So it's a lot of borrowing households and owning outright. So a combination of new developments, I would guess, and also quite a lot of old developments that have been owned for a long, long time. 58% in mortgage stress, a lot of people in rental stress. Overall financial stress is 58%. A lot of houses, 86%, some units and other types of property. People ratio is very high, so that is another indicator of more mature households. Vacancy rate's extremely low. And the gross investment yield is 3.3, but the net investment yield is still negative, minus 0.1%. Looking at the taxable income, 93,000 from the ATO versus 142,000 from the census. So again, multiple incomes going to pay the mortgage. And that gives a monthly disposal of more than $8,000, with 40% going on the typical mortgage at 3,240, or 37% at 2,990 going on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, the best case for houses, 1.5% over this next 12 months and 5.3% over 3 years. Base case is a fall, 4.1% over 12 months and 14.1% over 3 years. Worst case, fall of 9.7% this year and 35% over the next 3 years. So again, you can see some of the sensitivities. Okay, 2024 and 2025 is going to be rough. Well, let's go 2025. I'm not sure I did that one up. Let's have a look. Woollahra. Well, these are interesting. This is an interesting one, right? Because this is a low count, of course, but a very affluent count. You can see there the average taxable is more than $218,000, and the household count is actually household census is 156,000, so very high income. 28% are borrowing, a lot of owning outright, 34%, but there's a lot of renting there too. No mortgage stress, quite a lot of rental stress, a lot of investor stress in the area. So that could be a clue to what's going on ahead. And worth saying that the overall financial stress is at 66%, so it's pretty high. Looking at it, 17% are houses, a lot of units, 50% are units, and other types of property in the area. The vacancy rate is extremely high as well. Now, I'm not sure why that is. That could be maybe students and things were away when the census was done, or it could be some new properties being thrown up. I'm not sure. 3.5% gross investment yield, net investment yield positive 0.3. I've highlighted the high taxable incomes there. That gives a disposal monthly of more than $8,900. But look at this typical mortgage, 53% at 4,800. And the typical rent, 3,338, 37%. So a lot of cash flow there. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing quite a few people in some degree. But of course, more affluent people, despite the fact they're paying a lot more on their mortgage, are generally able to get away without registering any stress levels. Looking at the scenarios, because of the financial stress metric I've got here, there isn't much of a rise in terms of the best case over the next 2 or 3 years. There's a base case fall of 5% over the next 12 months and 16% over 3 years, and a worst case of 37% over 3 years if things go real pear-shaped. All right, what else have we got? Yeah, there's a bit of agreement, I think. A heated agreement, I call that. Right. Any more we've got, or is that it? Whoops. One of the problems with this chat system is that occasionally it jumps, which it did. Just let me go back to where I was. Dear. Trouble is I get so many conversations going on in the chat that I actually find it difficult to find where I was. 2213. This is what you do when you do self-drive. Because, of course, I'm running everything here, the whole show. The dogs are asleep. I'm doing it all. Okay, East Hills. 8,300 households with 30% earning outright, 43% borrowing, 26% renting. Mortgage stress at 46%, rental stress at 70%, some investor stress, 48% for the financial stress metric. This is 70% houses, some units and other types of property. High people count, so you can see there that the people ratio indicates perhaps more mature households with families. Vacancy rates at 5%, gross investment yield is 3.3%, but the net investment yield is minus 0.8%. Looking at the taxable income, 81,000 in the ATO and 110 from the census. So again, multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Gives a monthly disposable of 6,419 with 48% going on the average mortgage payment and 36.5% going on the average rent. From a scenario perspective, you can see here that the houses are looking positive in the best case scenario, maybe 3.9% this year and 12% over 3 years, but the base case is a bit of a fall, down 1.7% and 6.6% over 3 years, and the worst case scenario, even more of a fall. Okay. Steve asked for 4053. Which is McDowell in the Morton area. And here we've got 19,000 households with 40% borrowing and 35% renting, with 44% in mortgage stress and 84% in rental stress. We've got 76% houses and other units and types of property there too, with a 2.38 people ratio and a 5.6% vacancy rate. Gross investment yield is 4.6, net investment yield 0.4. Average taxable $83,000 versus $111,000. So again, multiple incomes going on that mortgage. Disposable monthly incomes 6,958, with 35% going on the typical mortgage of 2,476 and 29.4% go on the typical rent at just over $2,000. And looking at those scenarios, positive in the best case scenario, maybe 5% up over the next year or so and 13% over 3 years. But the base case is a small fall, minus 0.8, 12 months and 6.1% down over 3 years. Worst case, of course, even more dramatic falls. $2,229 being asked for. Caringbah, which is in and around the Sutherland area, includes Dolan's Bay and Tarrant Point. 12,000 households in the postcode, 4,000 are owning outright, which is 34%, 41% are borrowing, and 24% are renting. Stress is at 14.9%, but more rental stress is at 91.2%. Overall financial stress is quite high at 47%, including some investor stress there. 53% of houses, 23% of units on types of property, of course, there as well. 2.44%, so again, more mature households with families. Vacancy rate 6.2%, maybe some second homes there, or maybe some new builds, not sure. Gross investment yields 3.4%, but net investment yield minus 0.4%. How often do we see this, with net investment yields being negative? Looking at the taxable income, 105,000 versus 116,000, giving a disposable monthly of 6,536, with 55.1% going on that average mortgage. Ouch. 3600 and 38.1, 2492 going on the typical rent. Looking at the scenarios, best case scenario, this 12 months, 3.4% up, 11% over 3 years. The base case, a small fall, down 2.3 and 8.5 over 3 years. Worst case, down 7.6 and down 29.4%. You pay your money and you take your choice. Indeed. I'm trying to figure out things on the fly, so don't worry. Not a problem. David asked for 4078. 4078, Forest Lake up in Brisbane. 9419 households with 18% owning outright, 48% borrowing. You can bet your bottom dollar there's a lot of new bills going on up there then. 32% renting. Mortgage stress at 81%. Renters in rental stress, 87%. And overall financial stress at 75%. Ooh, that's high. Looking at what's going on, 90% of houses, so I reckon a lot of home and land packages in the area, small number of units and other types of property. High people ratio, 2.73, so more mature families with kids. Vacancy rate just 4%. Gross investment yield 4.7, net investment yield positive 0.9. You'll see here that the investment yields from a net perspective are better up in Queensland relative to New South Wales and Victoria generally. Now looking at the taxable, 69,000 versus 95, so that's a very clear signal of multiple incomes going to pay the mortgage. Disposable monthly income is at 5764 with 34% going on the average mortgage and 32% at 1843 going on the average rent. And looking at the scenarios, you can see the best case there is a small rise, 3.7% over the next 12 months and 9.3% over the next 3 years. But the base case is a small fall, down 2.1 and 10.3 over 3 years. And worst case, even more falls. Okay, Cookie Boy says 2095. Which is Manly. Manly has got 7391 households with 26% owning outright, 20% are borrowing, 52% are renting. So this is a more mature area, of course, less new developments, although there are some new developments in the area, particularly high-rise, but a lot of that's for rental. 12.5% in mortgage stress, 59% in rental stress, a lot of stressed investors, that's very significant and important to understand. 59.5% in financial stress. And look at this, houses, just 11.3% are houses, 76% are units. Of course, there's been a lot of redevelopment and new units being put up there. Other types as well, maybe over retail, under retail, or over retail. People ratio is a lot lower, so a lot of single people as well as larger families. High vacancy rates, that includes Airbnb and second homes and those sorts of things. Gross investment yield, 3.4%. Net investment yield, negative 0.5%. So all those stressed investors, a lot of them will be experiencing negative cash flow on their investment. Looking at the taxable income, 154,000 versus 164, and that gives a disposable of more than $10,000, with 40% on average going on the mortgage at 4,160 and 35.6% going on the typical rent, 3613, expensive place to rent. Scott asks for 4207. So Yatala from Brisbane and Moreton. And here we have 25,000 households with 19.8% owning outright, 40.9% are borrowing, 39% are renting. And you can see here it includes Logan Village and a few other areas. Again, just be clear that the location is based on what the ATO classifies the postcode as. This is actually all the suburbs included within it. 83% of houses, small number of units, and 2.55, so it's quite high here with the household count being probably including kids. 5.3% vacancy rates, 4.6% gross investment yield, net investment yield positive 0.9%. Average taxable, 65,000 versus 77,000 for the census, giving a disposable monthly of just over 5,000, with 39% going on the typical mortgage, just under $2,000, and 34% going on the average rent at 1,745. From a scenario perspective, the best case scenario is a rise, maybe 5% this year and 15% over 3 years, but the base case is a very small fall, and the worst case, a more significant fall. Very good. You're pretty much set up as a Twitch streamer trying to read chat, except you're discussing finance, property, and other news instead of reacting to clips and getting brain rot. Well, yeah, I hope I haven't got brain rot because I'm actually doing all this modeling and everything to be able to create the shows. Remember that this is my modeling. So this is based on a whole bunch of work that I do behind the scenes to be able to actually put this information together. So hopefully there's no brain rot here. If there is, let me know. Maybe I should consider stopping at that point. But no, I'm afraid that I'm not going to do the Twitch thing. I'm going to continue to do here. Although I did do a short. I don't know whether you saw I did a YouTube short for the first time for a few months advertising this show. So I'll be interested to see whether anybody watched it. We will see. Okay. Chris asked a few times. 3095. Please don't keep putting it in because you really do confuse the system here. I don't have a filter to ones that I've done already, so I can end up perhaps doing the same one twice, which of course is a bit of a waste of time. Anyway, I haven't done Eltham, so that's good. This is of course in the Melbourne suburbs there. 10,000 with 39% owning outright, but 50% borrowing and 10% renting. A third are in mortgage stress, 2/3 are in rental stress, and we've also got a lot of investor stress there too. So overall financial stress is quite high at 48%. 89% of houses, a small number of units, other types of property. People ratio is quite high, so again, mature households. Vacancy rates 4.4%. Gross investment yields 3.3%. Net investment yield negative. Again, surprising how many investment properties in the Melbourne area are underwater, minus 0.2. Looking at taxable income, 95,000 versus 130,000. So again, multiple incomes going on those mortgages. Gives a disposable monthly of 7,749, with 35% going on the typical mortgage, 2,746, and 28.9% going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, not a lot of hope, even in the best case scenario. I'm not seeing much in the way of price rises over the next 3 years. The base case would be a 5% fall over the next 12 months and 18% over 3 years. And worst case, even more significant falls. Yeah, slide audio problem, you say. Interesting. I haven't seen it here. So if other people are seeing the audio problem, tell me. You might try refreshing Drew. Sometimes the YouTube stream gets a bit confused, but I've got every indication here that the audio is okay. Okay. 3280. 3280. I do listen to myself, by the way, so I'm hearing what's going on. Okay. 3820. So this is Warrnambool, which is on the Otway Ranges. And here we have 14,000 households with 35% owning outright, 35% borrowing, and 29% renting. 19.6% are in mortgage stress, 66% are in rental stress. I've got a few stressed investors, and we've got some households in financial stress too. Looking at the mix, 83% of houses, a small number of units and the types of property, the 2.12 people ratio. So some suggesting it's more than individuals. 8.2% vacancies, that's probably some Airbnb and second homes and things there, holiday homes. Gross investment yield 3.4, net investment yield minus 0.4%. And that gives, minus 0.4% gives a another story here. Even in those more regional areas in Melbourne, we're also seeing negative returns for investment properties, not just in the CBD and surrounding areas. Looking at the taxable income, 69,000 versus 72,000, and the disposal monthly is 4,568, with 37% going on the mortgage and 32% going on the average rent, 1,470. Scenarios: best case, small rise, 2.4 and 6.4 over 3 years, and down 3.2% on the base case and 12.7%. It's interesting. It was around 20 seconds of static, says Theo. Interesting. Haven't seen that before. I'll have to listen back on the recording and see whether, in fact, it showed up there or whether it was something upstream from me. Of course, I'm streaming to YouTube. YouTube then does the processing, etc., etc. Very good. Hammered said, no brain rot here. Plenty of food to keep the mind engaged. Yeah, well, we try. I do try to be quite intelligent about the stuff I do here. So sometimes I wonder whether it goes over some people, but I'm glad that many people appreciate the work I do. And microphone is good now, which is good. Okay. BT said 4868. I'm going to run out of runway soon. There's Warri in the far north. And I'll put that back into the slide so you can see it. 4868. And there we've got 8,600 with 25% owning outright, 41% are borrowing, 33% are renting. We've got some mortgage stress, 44% and 43% of rental stress are pretty similar. We've got 82% houses, small number of units, other types of property there too. People ratio is 2.42 and the vacancy rate is 5.9. Gross investment yield is 4.3. Net investment yield is positive 0.3. We have an average taxable of 68,000 versus the census at 80,000, which gives a disposable monthly of 5,246, with 34% going on the typical mortgage and 33% going on the typical rent at just over $1,740. $1,740. And looking at the scenarios, there is a case where you might see price rises in the best and base case, small rise in the base case scenario, but the worst case could be a bit of a fall. So it depends, I guess. Peter asks for 3107. Templestowe Lower in Melbourne. And that's in the inner east. 5,300 households with 45% owning outright, so I'm a more mature suburb, but quite a few with mortgages, 36%, not many renting, 18%. 30% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress, and 80% of houses, small number of other types as well. People ratios, again on the high side, so you'd suggest that's going to be families with kids. 6.8% vacancy rate and 3.4% gross investment yield, 0.1% net investment yield. Average taxable 86 versus 99,000 gives a disposal monthly of 5,927 with 50%. Ooh, that's high. About $3,000 on typical mortgage and 40%, 2,372 going on the average rent. From a scenario perspective, in the best case scenario, very small fall rises 1.5% and 3.8% over 3 years, but a fall over the base case of down 4.1% and the worst case down 37% over 3 years. So we'll see what happens. Okay, we are getting close to the end of the show. I'm just going to do this one. 2034. This is Coogee in the eastern suburbs. Get rid of that so you can see it. 8753 households, 21% owning outright, 24% are borrowing, and 54% are renting. And that gives a low level of mortgage stress of 3.2, but a lot of rental stress at 80%, a lot of investor stress as well. And that means that households are in financial stress at 65%. It's quite high. Mostly units, 70%. Small number of houses, 17.6%, and other types of property. People ratio is a bit lower, so that will include some sole households. Vacancy rate's quite high at 11.7, so that's probably some Airbnb and second homes and things there as well. Gross investment yields 3.4, net investment yield is minus 0.1, so underwater. Average taxable 125,000 versus 145,000 for the census. Again, you'll see that more than one income going on average to the mortgage. 8,935 average monthly disposable, giving 45.7% going on the rent, on the mortgage, $4,000 and 34% going on the rent. And looking at the scenarios, best case, small rise, 3.5% over the next 12 months and 11% over 3 years. But the base case, a small fall, and the worst case, a more significant fall. Okay. MCM said it did have some static. Yep. Okay. Well, I can only check it out. I've got my normal chain here, but I will have a look and see whether I can sort it out later if it's something that is recurring. Okay, so we're pretty close to the end of the show. Just before I finish off, let me just say a couple of other things. So I'm going to switch back to this other picture. Now, I did get quite a few people in the YouTube chat asking for postcodes, and I did actually make a show where I went through about 20. I put it up yesterday. And what I'll do with the other postcodes in the general chat is I will incorporate them in another show later. You can also, if you want to get a snapshot for a particular postcode, if you contact me by the DFA blog, you can also request the one-page snapshot. And over the next few days, I'll send it to you. Just go to the DFA blog. The link's in the comments below. I prefer just to do one rather than ask for lots and lots and lots. But of course, if you do want lots and lots and lots, I'll tell you about how to get those in a second. Going back to the slides again, another AI generated. I asked the AI to produce me an empty wallet. And that's what the AI produced. So that was quite funny. Now, let me just say, this is really important. When people are getting into financial difficulty, it's really important that you get help from the right place. And unfortunately, there are a number of adverts in the Google search and other searches you might do, which are actually paid debt solution providers. They make money off people trying to help them with their debt. That's a real problem. So I always recommend the National Debt Helpline here. This is a very important source of help, 1-800-007-007. It's government backed, of course, and they can actually help to figure out what's going on. One of the things that often they talk about is building a cash flow, because only about half of households know what the money is looking like coming in, going out. Quite hard to manage your cash flow if you don't actually understand what is going on. And if you want a cash flow tool, you can go to the Asset Money Smart website. There's some really good tools there. But I always say to people, work out where your money's going, and then you can prioritize and perhaps hunker down and manage a little bit. One of the things that often happens, and I speak to the debt counselors quite often, is that people then reach for more debt, and buy now, pay later, or credit cards. But more debt doesn't necessarily help. And as like I said at the top of the show, you can't guarantee that rates are going to get cut quickly. And you can't guarantee that incomes are going to rise quickly, and you can't guarantee that inflation is going to dissipate. So it's really important to take ownership of your household finances and cash flow and things. So I do recommend cash flow. I do recommend prioritizing and then figuring out from there. Now, in terms of other things to say, of course, my blog does hold a lot of information with regard to what I do and all my shows and things. So if you've not done a check of my blog recently, go and check the blog. You'll also see the little tool there to be able to send me a message directly. It's down on the bottom of the every blog page. I also, of course, run Patreon, and there's a range of memberships. People do support me. I do appreciate those supporters. It's really important. It helps me just to cover the cost of what I do here. I say I don't make this for profit. I do this because I think there's a really important conversation. One of the important things to understand is that one of the tiers is actually the snapshot that I've been showing for every single postcode in the model. And you can subscribe, and it's there. It's $50 a month plus GST. You can join, and you can sign up for a month and get the data, and then unsign or stay subscribed. I have quite a few people who subscribe to that, and again, it helps to just make things a little bit easier with regards to my cash flow. Believe me, there's a lot of work involved in putting all this material together. And I want to highlight again, the reason I do this is because I don't believe that the mainstream media and the property portals are actually telling the full story with regard to what's going on. Of course, there are some people doing fine, and even the RBA tends to aggregate and average, and tends to use information which, frankly, is a bit optimistic. Now, I'm not trying to be negative here. What I'm saying is that there are people with real issues, and you've seen these multiples where people are actually putting 40 to 50% of their income to support their mortgages at the moment. That's a real problem in the context of the economy that's slowing, in the context of high inflation. So this is why this is a really important conversation. If you would also like to support me, another way of doing it is just to make a one-off donation via PayPal. Greatly appreciated those who do that. Again, it just helps to cover some of the costs of what I do here. So if that's something that's of interest to you, there's a link there. Of course, I also do receive Bitcoin. Bit of a joke, really, but if anybody wants to send me Bitcoin, there's a QR code to do that as well. Well, there we are. That's pretty much it. We're at the end of the show. Thanks for hanging with me through to the end. And as always, really appreciate all the comments, questions. I didn't necessarily get to every postcode in the live chat. Those aren't easy to track afterwards. So if you would like a postcode, you can put it in again in the show afterwards, and I'll go and find it later, or send me a message directly from the blog, and I can help with that there as well. But I'll be doing this next month again as well. Also be interested to know whether you liked this format where I sort of rushed through the earlier part and went into this in more detail, compared with the previous shows where I'd have spent more time going through the geo mapping and those sorts of things. If you want the geo maps, just a reminder that it does exist. It was actually shown already in the earlier show that I put up. And what that means is that I had more time then to go into the more detailed, specific research that I did. But, tell me if you like that format or not. Be interested to know, because I'm trying to work out the best way to make the best use that I can of the time. And just to be clear, if you want the geomapping, go to the Household Financial Distress show there. I went through it in a lot of detail. I will also make another show, because I had a few people ask me for more information about geomapping. So expect a couple of shows coming on the geomapping too. Anyway, that's it. I think we're done. I'm not sure what the dogs are up to. Let's have a look. Oh, there they are. They're still there. They've been sleeping quite merrily through the whole show, which is great. And I'm glad they didn't make too much noise. Just to say that next week, I'm going to have Robbie Barwick on, and we're going to talk about some of the campaigns that are currently running, and the campaigns that we're running this year, specifically, of course, relating to the use of cash, the regional branch closure issue, and also, importantly, the RBA and how independent it will be, because Chalmers is trying to sort of walk away from controlling the RBA at all, and we think that's a problem too. So we're going to discuss some of those issues next week, so mark your diaries for that. And I want to say again, thanks very much for all of those who spent time with me tonight. Hope you found it useful, informative, and with everything to do with finances, first become aware of what the issues are, and then start managing them, because I believe that individuals need to manage these financial issues themselves. They can't rely on the government to get out of jail, can't rely on the RBA to get out of jail. Unfortunately, the RBA will bail out the big banks, but unfortunately, we have to look after households ourselves, because there's no one else to do it. With that thought, thank you very much for watching. See you next week. Look forward to seeing you on our shows as well, if you decide to watch some of the recorded shows during the week. And I'll see you live next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.